I think one of the main things that we're encouraging our members to do right now is start to understand the changes in their community, in their travel patterns, in the ridership patterns they're seeing, and in as honest a way as possible, look at it through the prism of what's temporary and what's permanent. And that's really critical. And you can think it's really easy to say, I've met with and worked with a lot of economists in the last year and a half, city planners, and there seems to be an emerging consensus around the idea that, well, telework should be about 20%, 1 day a week, taking root for the majority of the workforce. Well, that's a massive hit on a large urban operator's fare box revenues, 20%. How is that changing? And you'll see this. I think the other thing that we've also understood over the last 18 months, and I think where we've really shown our mettle, is around essential and understanding for whom our services are essential. And when systems retracted in March, April, and May of 2020, and we had members. Now, smaller agencies, the ones we work with, tend to have more essential passengers as part of their normal ridership. And so we immediately found the majority of our members, they're outliers on both sides, were telling us through our surveying that the bottom was 40%, 50%. Our members that are operating fixed route environments, doing kind of traditional urban transit, that number was steeper. In some cases, it was 20, 30%. I talked to, on the East Coast where I live in Maryland, commuter rail operators, they were at 3%. Massive ridership loss, but some people rode all along. They were part of the essential workforce that we needed. And we learned, maybe at the beginning of a pandemic, we didn't think of people working in a grocery store as essential, but we sure do now, don't we? And these are the lessons that essentialness teaches us. And these are the building blocks for how we rebuild and redesign our services. We've learned something. And I think that's a critical piece here, is all of you as transit leaders with this decision-making around where do the vehicles go? What are we emphasizing? That essential tells us something, doesn't it? We saw a lot of our members, for safety reasons, go fareless. They wanted to reduce interactions between driver and passenger. Frankly, once the CARES Act funding passed, there was a lot of federal money flowing that could make up the difference, initially at least in lost fare box revenues. And we've had, over the last 6 months, a number of our members say, I'm sticking with that. It's working. And I tend to ask them, well, how are you selling that? Both short and long term. I think it's a lot of kind of the mentality we need to use right now. We've seen so many important partnerships develop during the pandemic that we need to continue. And those can't be temporary. Public health, healthcare in general, in a lot of cases, emergency operations centers and the ability to work with those folks. Local planning bodies. As we retracted our services and started to then build them back, these partnerships have been critical. And we produced a white paper recently on lessons learned And that is really one of the key ones, is to continue those partnerships and understand, look, I like to be realistic. If you are waiting for COVID-19 to completely go away, you're going to be waiting a long time. The key to the future of the economy is all of us being able to work within and come up with a workable way to deal with this as part of our lives. Just like the flu is part of our lives, and ideally we get to that point. But I think the last few months, the emergence of the Delta variant, additional variants being tracked around the world, tell us that we are not going to get to zero. It's going to be with us for a while. And those partnerships, I think, are going to be really important in how we work with and get to a workable place where we can all enjoy our lives and leave the house again. Incidental use. So right off the bat, and our partners at the Federal Transit Administration have been really amazing and shown flexibility that many of us weren't sure they were capable of initially, both in how they rolled funding out and also how aggressively flexible they were. And the incidental services was a critical one. Right off the bat, a lot of our members move their services to delivering food and groceries and prescriptions. We had members parking vehicles that were Wi-Fi enabled in communities so people could link in. And many of you, I'm sure, and I hope I have some time to talk with you today, have come up with equally innovative kind of new uses of your services that made a lot of sense in the pandemic. And FTA was great about allowing that. And those, again, are a reality of value. And we're going to talk about the new value of public transit. Those shown value. And our partners at FTA have been really great about making sure we can continue to do those things. And lastly, we're all talking about service redesigns. In fact, many of us were talking about that prior to the pandemic, and trying to match up transit operations in all size communities with what people want, which seems so basic and elementary, but yet is very difficult to do. And a lot during the pandemic from our membership, we've had people engage with the community in ways they hadn't in the past and learned lessons that they need to apply to how you put your service on the streets and what those redesigns look like. I, for one, have felt and feel now that the flexibility of bus service and its ability to move quickly, whether it's at one end BRT and it's at the other end, many of my members who have moved to running vehicles and sedans and doing on-demand transit in highly innovative ways. I feel like that future, the ability to be flexible, particularly as we figure out what this new normal is going to be so important. So the fundamentals, okay, we talked big picture, all these changes, but what does that look like at your operation? Customer focused, obviously, full accessibility, integration of modes, public, private. We've got to have our systems work together and work together not so that your board and your operations teams feel that it's working together, but the customers feel that it works together and that it's seamless. Purpose-driven. This is an important one. I sat in yesterday after I arrived on a really great discussion that was going on in the Missouri Public Transit Association meeting about value and how do we speak about the value of transit and public transportation and kind of transition that in ways to get elected officials, in this case at the state level, to invest more in public transit. And the way that is by speaking about what happens, what we do, and not just counting rides, but where are people going? And what is the value that comes from that, whether it's in the healthcare space. And that's one that we've done a lot of work in. That's the simplest to equate, because you can work with a hospital and you can say, what's the value of reducing no-shows? What does each no-show cost you? And how many of them are due to a lack of transportation? And we have found in working with private and public healthcare entities that reductions of 5 and 10% in no-shows have massive financial impact on the healthcare system and drives their willingness to invest in mobility solutions to fix that. Yeah, improper use of emergency rooms. And there's just so much in the healthcare space that is a financial piece. Employment, work. I look and I think about tax valuations around transit facilities in urban areas, land values. We have ways of talking about transit that are so much more than just talking about ridership. And last month, I've been on a couple different listening sessions that the FTA sponsored. And again, they were virtual in nature. And I found myself continuing to say, we're at a period right now where ridership is not going to be our strength. We're going to get back there, but right now it's not. We need to speak about the quality of the trips rather than the quantity. There's a lot of different cliches I could throw at you, but you know what that means in your community, and you know that essentialness that we talked about earlier. And we have to match these things up when we're talking to folks about what we do. Clean and safe, of course, fundamental, has to be there. And we have a completely new definition of safe. Pre-pandemic, safe was driver training. It was ensuring, as Talby was showing, bi-state's work on making sure passengers felt safe. It was well-maintained vehicles. And now it's cleaning protocols, and it's social distancing. And I saw it immediately when I would talk to people who were riding in those essential riders and living in the DC metro area. We have a lot of different, we're lucky, we have a very rich transit environment. And all they wanted to know when they had their smartphone out pre-pandemic was, when's the bus get here? When's the next train? Now they wanted to know, well, how crowded is that bus or train? It all spoke to an emerging, and I think relatively permanent. I don't think you're just going to stop cleaning your vehicles next year, or that you're not going to need varying forms of PPE to continue to provide safe service. I talked about flexible. The data-driven piece, I think, is here to stay. We saw that pre-pandemic. The more agencies have the ability and staff to understand their data, the better you can talk about your operations. And again, that gets to being able to talk about what we do way more than just saying, here's our ridership. Right size technology, and then, as we'll talk about from the federal level, robust investment. A scalable and mobility ecosystem is where we see the future. And we saw that future previous to the pandemic. And I think that's the key to the future moving out of the pandemic. Customers, universal payment, wayfinding and trip planning, full system travel training. How are we teaching people how to use our services? Rolling stock flexibility. This scalability is critical right now. And I think the notion of a full mobility ecosystem is what our customers are telling us they want. They want to be able to trip plan, particularly in urban areas. And they want to have options. And they want to be able to use those options in a seamless way. I think value, again, I've talked about beyond ridership, but I think I want to underscore this piece. Understanding and communicating your value. And it's all of these pieces here. And I'm going to focus on the air quality piece, because we went in DC through a number of years where you couldn't really talk about environmental impacts. It just politically, it didn't sell. And my goodness, we had our small urban conference in Missoula, Montana a month ago. And in addition to worrying about the pandemic, we were worried about fires. And the hotel we had the conference at the weekend before called and said, the outdoor events you have, which we were thinking we really want to have in the middle of a pandemic, we're not allowing our employees outside because the air quality is so bad. And the day before we arrived, a storm kind of blew the smoke out of the Missoula Valley, and we were okay. But it was a stark reminder, as was the havoc wreaked by Hurricane Ida in the last 10 days, that we have a role to play, an important role to play in the environmental stewardship of the planet. And we don't often speak about that enough. How many vehicles we take off the road, our reductions in emissions. And I think it's something that if you're not good at talking about, you need to start to get an understanding of your role in that, because it's important, and it's really going to inform a lot of what happens in Washington moving forward. Let's talk now about the policy landscape, which is to answer that question, what's the future in funding? And I began working on transit policy in DC when I think it was iced tea. And I've worked many, back when we had to have tea in every name of every 5-year bill. And I've never seen anything like the last 18 months. The amount of money is astounding, and at times bewildering. Mid-March 2020, we were working with the House and the Senate on what ended up being the CARES Act, and they called and they said, what does rural transit need? What will your members need? And now remember, in March of 2020, we kind of had a horizon of September 30, 2020. Like, this pandemic couldn't possibly go that long, but we'll develop federal policy that encompasses that time frame. And we went to our members and extrapolated, and we looked at kind of initial ridership losses and obviously the desire at that point to allow all of our members to, through the pandemic, be able to pay their staff and not lose their employees. And I think we came back with a number internally of, like, we thought $400 million, which seemed obscene to ask for. And then we bounced it around, and Randy from the CTA board is here from Iowa. We bounced around with our legislative committee, and I think we said, well, let's move that up. And I think we said $500 million for rural should make that work. And it was a Friday late evening. I can't remember which day of the month it was. And on Sunday, I got a call, and they said, well, okay, we appreciate all what you got us, and how's $2 billion sound? which, I'm not really used to that in DC. And I said, well, that'll do just fine. And that's kind of the way it's worked. It's been this crazy shift. I mean, I never thought I would see in less than a year, $70 billion off budget outside of the normative appropriations process. And all of it dropped at 100% federal, needing no local share in 11 months. And it was unprecedented. I remember very much the ARA and the stimulus programs in that era. And this was, 4 or 5 times that. And as they kept investing in all these things, and these funds were necessary and needed and put to use immediately, you started to understand, though, that, well, we've got a reauthorization coming. The FAST Act is expiring September 30, 2020. And I got very concerned, because I've been around Congress a long time, that there's usually kind of a equal and opposite reaction to everything. And I've lived and worked through, I'll call it congressional buyer's remorse, and really was concerned about the impact on the 5-year reauthorization of the FAST Act, because that's kind of the foundational linchpin of how we fund public transportation in the country. Everything plays off of that bill. And though these emergency stimulus funds were needed, it was trying to kind of find that fine line between the needed emergency funds, but not to take away from or have that negatively influence the reauthorization. And then you had, in the middle of that, you had a presidential election, and then we had an administration that arrives, and on top of all this, they want to invest $110 billion in capital. And I was in a lot of meetings on the Hill, most all of them virtual, where we kind of, those of us who advocate on behalf of public transit were almost like, hey, is this real? And through this summer, I started to see the change and the president couldn't get that 110 billion done. And there started to be the initial backlash to the $70 billion. We certainly saw that if you were paying any attention to the United States Senate and its deliberations over its part. The House puts out an Invest Act. It was a very strong piece of legislation. Chairman DeFazio and his team obviously see a very important role for public transportation moving forward. And they see a very important role for public transportation moving forward within that environmental piece too. We like that bill. And but it was clear that the Senate was not going to go along with that legislation. And we found ourselves in this really odd place where the Senate refused, a banking committee in the United States Senate does the transit title. Highway title in the Senate through the Environment Public Works Committee sailed right through, no problem. All of a sudden, transit is a partisan issue, and all the Republicans on the committee, particularly the leadership, wanted to talk about was how much transit had gotten through all these stimulus funds. And I thought, oh boy, here we go. And in the end, what's sitting and hopefully will be voted on the 27th of September is a very positive bill for public transit. So, my answer on the outlook is it's very strong right now. Now, is it perfect? No. But having done this a long time, it's the imperfect bills that last. There's a lot of folks on the very left of the political spectrum in Washington who don't like the current agreement. They wanted to move the highway transit split of trust fund dollars closer to 50-50. And, that's fine. And we would certainly like to see that as well. But the votes aren't there for that. And so we had a lot of people coming to us saying, don't support this bipartisan Senate agreement. And I found myself in a couple of meetings and I kind of said to those folks, I know for you, this is a academic exercise, but for CTAA, for APTA, for a lot of others, we have systems that got to make pullout tomorrow. This is not an academic exercise. This is one where we serve people. Those people expect the buses and the trains to be there tomorrow. And when we see a bill that increases all formula programs by 40% over 5 years, it's hard to say, oh, this is a terrible bill, because it's not. And I think the House will pass the bill. Now, the next piece is the budget reconciliation. And I don't want to get too into the weeds on DC, but basically that's a process by which a partisan piece of legislation attempts to be passed with no votes from the other side, none. And as the rescue plan is a perfect example of how budget reconciliation works, but there's a lot of arcane rules with it, including no double dipping, no new policies are to be, and not that I would hope most of you are not paying attention, but those of us in DC, we're suddenly interested in what the Senate parliamentarian has to say about things. That was a first. And I think where we're going to land on that is we're going to push for things. And I think it'd be nice to get some additional funding for public transit through a budget reconciliation process. But my recommendation to you would be, I wouldn't put that in your budgets yet. And that we've got a win on the table. This infrastructure agreement is a win. And let's take that win and let's have investment in public transit locked in for the next 5 years, so that next November, when perhaps party leadership changes and that congressional remorse that I was talking about sets in, we're locked in. And we have the ability to weather that storm. Tuck, in reading Mokt's remarks, echoed one sentiment that I also want to talk about, which is that compliance piece right now. And I want FTA, and I've shared this with the leadership, to use the next round of triennial reviews and state management reviews to build a more collegial, friendly, and productive process in its audits and reviews, and have urged them to provide some insights prior to these audits and reviews happening on how best to get your houses in order when it comes to how you have spent and managed these stimulus funds. That rather than this be a gotcha situation, These are, as we've all agreed, unprecedented times. Let's reconfigure that piece of the audit relationship into one that can be a teaching and learning experience, and also that can be one that acknowledges that there were things that had to be done in the pandemic that had to be done. You know, how many of you cut service out of safety's sake in the initial months of the pandemic without going through all of the normal steps you would have to go through? And that wasn't your desire to skirt regulations. That was our reality, as one obvious example. The whole stimulus funding through the COVID stimulus funds has really presented some interesting dynamics. For smaller agencies, the funding tended to be on average, if you were a rural transit operator, states received on average, some states got more than this, about 3 years worth of Section 5311 funds just through these programs. And I was just getting bombarded with, why haven't they spent it all? And I kept saying, well, it's 3 years worth of funding, and it's going to take 3 years to spend it on average. And I would be in these meetings, and you would hear, we're very concerned about the way transit systems are spending this money. And then the next sentence would be, and why aren't they spending it quickly? And I kind of said, well, which one do you want? And we've urged our membership to err on the side of spending it properly, which may not mean it spends as quickly, but that does not mean it's not valued, and that it's not needed, and that it won't be used in its entirety. And I've seen certain states say, put artificial end dates on money that has no end date at the federal side, and that confuses me where I've seen that. I don't understand why we would do that. And you know, the use of it, operating versus capital versus PPP, we're seeing a lot of that. The new wrinkles in the transit policy landscape are going to be, and we're surveying our members as we speak to try to help you all, you know, what are we doing vaccination policy-wise? And what are systems that are mandating the vaccine, which is happening? What's the fallout from that? How many drivers are they losing? How many mechanics are they losing when they mandate the vaccine? How are they handling? Who's paying for, in those mandate situations, mandatory testing every week? It's going to be a very interesting period here over the next 3 to 6 months on how that all gets adopted and adapted by your boards and you folks, and how we deal with that from an HR perspective. But we need data, and we need to understand what the early adopters are seeing so that we can help all of you make the best decisions possible to keep people safe, right? I mean, that's the whole point of that. But it's something that every system, regardless of size, is struggling with. And we're seeing labor shortages, the likes of which we've never seen before. The ability, one of the pieces that was in some of the FAST Act work, which we spent a lot of time and energy fighting, there was a really tragic limousine accident in New York State in 2018. And as is typical of DC, a House member and both senators from New York, their takeaway from that accident was a blanket change that any vehicle would need a CDL driver now down to, I think it was 6 or 7 passengers, down from 16 passengers. And you know, we looked and we realized how many of our members are currently operating vehicles in that size and how many additional drivers they would need to have certified with CDLs. And it was, we estimated at least 40,000. And we know how much time and expense it takes now to get a driver with a CDL. We know how many of those then get poached by other industries. We're looking at labor shortages, and we went to these senators and we said, you know, you've thrown a net in the water and you've captured a lot of things you didn't mean to capture. And if you want to apply this to limousine drivers, I and my staff will write it for you to make sure it applies only to limousine drivers. In the end, we were able to kill that off. And in true DC fashion, as we looked at the tragic accident that happened, that was the impetus for all that, we found that driver did have a CDL. But we were able to kill that off, thankfully. And I think that's right now where we are. We're dealing with these kind of brush fire issues that are all parts of the way we emerge out of the pandemic. And there, I know I've talked to some of you. I'm hearing from a lot of state DOTs, the inability to get vehicles because of that chip crisis. And my concern is that the optics of money not being spent because we don't have the inventory to buy vehicles, but we've increased the capital pots by 40%, and worrying that some members of Congress will take that to mean we don't need it. And for a lot of smaller agencies, I think matching an additional 40% in the normative way at a time when local economies have been hit in an unprecedented way is going to be a challenge. And we are looking for all sorts of ways to kind of mitigate that local share need and try to elongate some of the 100% funds as long as possible to allow smaller communities to emerge out of the economic crisis that will take longer. What we did learn from the 2009 to 2011 crisis brought on by the housing and other issues, that was that rural and smaller communities take longer to recover. And that's also been part of our messaging. So the picture on funding is a good one, but it's tempered by the fluid situation we're all in. And trying to understand best right now, as ideally these increases in funding slip into your budgets, how best to use them to help you emerge successfully out of this pandemic and into the new normal. And I would be lying if I said we have all the answers. We're trying to develop resources and research. We're doing all sorts of surveying. We're going to provide as much information to all of you as we can. It's a two-way street. I need to hear from you, and my staff needs to hear from you about what seems to be working, what you tried and didn't work, where you're finding those partnerships that are going to live and breathe beyond the pandemic, how you're communicating safety and alleviating those concerns on the part of the riding public, and how you're attracting back that other half of your ridership, and how the new travel and commuting patterns you've seen emerge in your communities, what they're like, and how you've used your flexible operations to serve them. This is all going to be this next period that we're in now. And thankfully, we're in it not with funding cuts. That would be disastrous. But we are in it with resources, but we've got to be careful. And we've got to make good decisions. And what those good decisions are going to be are different in different communities. But there's never been a time where we're going to rely more on good local transit leaders. And I've been at CTA for 30 plus years. And that's always been a good bet. It's always been a really good bet to allow you at the local level to figure out how best to serve your communities. And our bet right now is you're going to do that. And you're going to come up with these ways. And I just hope that we can be there in all the ways possible to support you as we all kind of do this unprecedented work. So thanks for the time to be here. I really do appreciate it. I'm happy to, we got about 10 minutes or so. I'm happy to take any questions. You must have some about what's been going on in DC. Yell them out and I'll repeat them on the mic. But it has been a whirlwind. And though we couldn't have face-to-face meetings, wow, so much was going on in the transit space when it comes to legislation and policy. So any questions, comments? Paul, he's right up front so I can see him.
You brought up the point on the spend it fast narrative. I think it's extremely effective. It notes a failure of to translate to our legislators what we did. But that temptation really backs on.
Yes.
Transit is not a, I'm sorry, thank you, is not a 1 year, a 12-month adventure.
No.
It's a multi-year adventure. And so how do we get that there? Thank you.
So if you, the early piece before he had the microphone is really spend it fast versus a more thoughtful approach to the resources that we see as part of the stimulus funds. And yeah, it's been troubling. And I think, look, the big urban operators and their loss of fare box revenue has driven a lot of that discussion. And I do understand that. And I can't remember the number that the MTA in New York was losing daily at the height of the pandemic, but it was $500,000 a day in lost revenues. And so I do understand that. And I understand the drive to be able to show that because this is emergency stimulus. What we've tried to say is the impact of the pandemic is not a weekly event. It's going to be an annual and a multi-year event. And therefore these funds, which Congress gave no end date to on the first two tranches and on the rescue plan funds, it was still a good 3 years out. They understand that. And I frankly think that it's partisan in many ways. This what we're getting thrown at us to spend it immediately is to set up exactly the dynamic that when you haven't, that is some failure and that you didn't need the funds. And so what we've urged our members to do, and I've worked with the 50 state DOTs from the rural funding, where they're the recipients from FTA, is to talk about the short and long-term plans for the funds, communicate very clearly when they anticipate being through the funding and why they anticipate taking it. And in some ways, it's just openly communicating that I have a plan. And the plan is informed by these data points, these partnerships, these purpose-driven outcomes that we want to create with transit in the community. And this is the plan. And in the cases where we've done that, we've had pretty difficult to work with Republican senators back off and go, oh, okay. And that was the goal. It's different though if you are in, and I can't speak to your St. Louis's situation directly, but a lot of folks in the bigger urbans, they went through this CARES Act money fast. They needed more. And in that case, there's a different piece to it. But it's, I think, alleviating the fear that this money is going to not be spent and that it's kind of being done without any proper planning and the spend out. I think that is the first piece. And then you have to understand that some of the people that are asking that already know the answer they want and trying to avoid falling in to that trap. And that's an unfortunate piece of the partisanship that we see in Washington right now that makes it hard to get anything done, is people springing that trap on us. But the smaller agencies, CTA's bigger members, which are going to be in population basis 300,000 to 200,000 in that range, a lot of small cities. That's what we've told them, is just to show your plan. You know, let them see what you intend to do with the funds, and take that off the table. Don't let them develop their own narrative on what's happening here. And a good way to indicate success on that, if you look at that bipartisan infrastructure deal, there are CARES Act funds rescinded and taken away and moved back into the funding for this bill. Not a single penny of that's in the transit field. So in many ways, I feel like we weathered that storm. And if we were going to see the most negative impact from that, that's where we would have seen it, is particularly in the development of that, by, you know, that agreement. They would have taken back some unspent funds. And that would have been the signal that we hadn't done that properly. The fact that they didn't, I took as a good message.
If you got a question, raise your hand. It's hard to see you with those lights. What a docile crowd. Of course, you're not very good at answering questions. The one I have for you is, what's going to happen later this month? Will they pass the infrastructure bill, and reconciliation will hang pending? Will they get Manchin on board? Is it going to go down to $1.5 billion? And what do we need to do as agency folks and lobbyists and whatever the hell we are here, in terms of communicating over the next couple of weeks?
It's a great question, Tuck.
Well, of course it is. I knew that.
Yes.
That's why I asked it.
I mean, coming from someone who thanks himself, look, the House vote on the 27th is the bill. And we'll be encouraging all of our membership to communicate to their House member. And this is the important piece, that the bill is good for your agency. They need to know that because it was negotiated on the Senate side largely, and with the Senate leadership, and the Biden administration did all the negotiating on this piece of legislation. You need to let your House members know who will be making this critical vote that it's good, and here's why. And if you want to know the here's why, I'll put my email address up and shoot me an email, and I'll hit you with a couple talking points depending on your agency. But that's the message right now. We're we're going to join with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and another large group of highway and transit advocates. I imagine APTA will be doing the same, has been asked the same, to encourage strongly to take the deal that's on the table. So that's the first piece. I think if we're going to get anything out of budget reconciliation, that it'll be a reduced number, and that the trillions of dollars that they've spent has to slow down. And will transit get any of that? Potentially. The interesting dynamic was you had a House bill, the Invest Act, that had all sorts of new policies, new programs, important new programs that virtually none of them found their way into this agreement. And in fact, the setup of the agreement was that there was to be no new policies. Some of them we were happy to see we were able to get in. But so those House members have some things that they worked on, led by Chairman DeFazio, that they are going to want to move into budget reconciliation because they represent, a lot of work that they put into that. Indications are that some of those things, particularly, they want to focus some funding on traditionally underserved and low-income communities. That they had a lot in Invest that doesn't show up at all in the Senate bill. I'd like to see that. We'd certainly support that. But I'd like to not have those two things linked. Let's get the win that's on the table, have the House vote that, then we can work on the next piece.
These people want to go drink coffee.
I can understand.
Anybody else? Can't see.
Well,
Thank you, Scott.
yeah, please, I'll be around today. If you want to chat, I'm happy to, but thanks for your time. Thanks for the great work you do in your communities. It's an honor to be in my position where I get to talk about the great work you do and try to make sure you have the funding you need. So thanks for your time this morning.
Thank you, Scott. Thought-provoking as always. Hope you have a great 2 days of learning and networking with others across the country on transit. We do have a couple of housekeeping items I want to mention. Don't forget to stop by and see our exhibitors throughout the day. They are a big piece of what makes this possible. So visiting them is a great way to thank them. The reception this evening at the St. Louis Gateway Arch will offer a unique venue, and we hope you'll join us. The Arch is definitely within walking distance. However, there'll be several shuttles beginning to load passengers at 6:30 p.m. on Washington Avenue. If you prefer to take a ride on one of our sponsor vehicles, including Central States Bus Company, Creative Bus Sales, and Southern Bus and Mobility, you may do so. All mobile workshops are going to meet at the bottom of the escalator on the first floor. So keep that in mind for those of you who are attending those. Also, we'd like to thank you as well for all your patience. COVID has made everything just a little more challenging, and we appreciate your patience with us as we navigate our way back to in-person events. Special shout out to our vendors who have worked with us over the past several weeks with ever-changing protocols. It is a very fluid situation, and we do appreciate their flexibility. With your help, transit will continue to deliver essential service. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of your day.